An electric performance car that really changed the game for me was the Lucid Air Sapphire. Marquez and I both got to drive that car a lot, and not only did it show me that my spine can move in ways I never knew it could, but it was more than just the acceleration. That car really showed me that with an EV, especially a performance EV, you could kind of have your cake and eat it too, with the tremendous amounts of storage space, the interior space, and the best-in-class range. And so when Porsche announced their new flagship Taycan, the Turbo GT, I was dying to see what their response would be to the Lucid Air Sapphire, which to a lot of people is the best practical electric performance sedan with actually usable range. And so I've done nearly 1,000 miles in the car in the few days that I've had it, and it's led me to discover a few things and come to a realization as far as where this car stacks up against the Lucid Air Sapphire that I'm going to try to break down for you guys today. So not only is this a new trim of the Taycan, the GT, that we've never had before, but this is a new generation of Taycan, a facelift if you will. And one of the major aesthetic changes between this and the previous gen is with the headlights. They no longer have that kind of indented teardrop kind of design to them. It's a bit more plain, and some would say a little bit more boring. But personally, I don't mind it. I think it looks fine. Another change that is basically the same as far as a flagship Taycan, but different across the entire model lineup, is that we now have this motorized charge port as standard. So you swipe it like that, and then your charge port opens up. And we'll talk a bit more about charging a little bit more in this video. But then, taking a look at the back, we now have this updated taillight design, which honestly looks really sick, especially when you see it lit up at night. You can kind of just see this Porsche design in here. This looks really cool. As far as the GT specific changes, well, there are a few that separate this from the standard Taycan Turbo and Turbo S. And the first one being, you now have this pretty aggressive front lip on the car, and a lot of people would probably be disappointed by the fact that this isn't a carbon fiber lip, but I am very happy about it, and here's why. Well, if you're taking a look at the car here, you can see that it's pretty low to the ground, especially for a sedan. It's not very high off the ground. We'll talk a bit more about the suspension setup in this car, but naturally in its natural position, it's pretty low to the ground, and so it's very easy to scrape. I'm not going to confirm or deny whether I've scraped this car a few times, but it is good to know that if you scrape this car, it's only a $300 part to replace if you decide you want to replace it. But when taking a look at the side, we've got carbon fiber mirror caps, which isn't anything crazy special. You can get that on a regular Taycan if you'd like. But then another unique thing is that the B-pillar is now in carbon fiber instead of just like gloss black plastic or aluminum, which actually looks really cool. That's a standout aesthetic thing for me. And then our side skirts, these are plastic. Sorry, you're gonna hear a lot of that. There's a lot of cars on the crest ripping around today. It's a nice day outside. So like I said, the side skirts, mostly plastic, but then we have a little carbon insert right here just for some aesthetic flair. And then you get all the way to the back, and then you have an aggressive kind of like rear diffuser situation going on here. And then we have this carbon fiber lip spoiler, kind of like ducktail shape in the back, which looks pretty cool. And this is an active aero wing that will go up and down at certain speeds when you're driving on the freeway or, you know, ripping around on Angela's Crest, things like that. But outside of that, and then I guess the wheels too, these are lightweight forged wheels that come as standard with the Taycan Turbo GT and the Turbo GT with the Weissach pack, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But as far as that, that's pretty much all the aesthetic changes with the Turbo GT compared to a Turbo S. This is a really nice design. I'm a fan of this. I know a lot of people don't like the way the Lucid Airs look. I personally don't mind the Sapphire version of the car. I think the Sapphire looks pretty nice, but I think the Taycan takes the cake in terms of design. But I guess that's pretty subjective. As far as performance-oriented things that you can see on the outside, a big one is obviously these massive, massive brakes. I'm not sure of the exact millimeter size of the rotors here, but it has to be over 400 millimeters wide. And then this caliper is literally bigger than my head. It honestly might be wider than my torso. This is a 10 piston caliper, which I'm sure makes this probably the biggest brake on any electric car probably in existence, at least as far as an electric sedan goes. But this is just, this is absurd. But when you've got as much power as this car has, having brakes this big makes plenty of sense. But this is, I can't get over how big this thing looks. Something that has kind of always disappointed me though with the Taycan is the front storage space. So we've got our key here. That'll open up the frunk, and that reveals this amount of space, which, I mean, it's fine. It's usable, I guess, but just for reference, the 911, the Porsche 911's front trunk is 4.6 cubic feet. This is only 2.9 cubic feet. And then the Lucid Air Sapphire is 10 cubic feet. Like, I can literally fit my entire body in the Lucid Air Sapphire's front trunk. Granted, it would be incredibly uncomfortable, but I can do it. And this car, not so much. As far as Porsches with a front trunk, which would be like the Cayman, the Boxster, and the 911, this is at the bottom of the totem pole, which, you know, it's kind of interesting given that this is the electric car that's supposed to be all about practicality and, you know, making your life easier. Now, when coming around to the rear trunk of this car, it's also just fine. There isn't a crazy amount of room in here. You have this bottom hidden storage area right here and some little pockets on the side to like probably store some tools like, you know, tire, air filler, etc., things like that. But it's not the best amount of storage space for an EV by any means. And like I said, if we're going to compare this to the current king of overall performance sedans, the Sapphire, this just doesn't hold up in terms of overall practicality. Let's take a look at the inside and see what we've got going on here with the Taycan Turbo GT. But something to point out, when I open the door here, right, I go like that, you're going to see the suspension raise like this and raise up off the wheels super high like that. So apparently a common complaint with the Taycan by a lot of users, and, you know, keep in mind, a lot of Porsche's customer base is on the older side with not so great knees like me. And so they were complaining a lot that the Taycan was a bit too low and not the best to get in and out of. And so with their new suspension system, they were able to implement this, which raises the car as soon as you want to get inside. And this is a feature that you can turn off, but it's good to be able to have. And honestly, I like using it. I've kept it on the entire time, even though I don't really need it. But let's take a look inside the Turbo GT. Yeah, this is a nice place to be. Let's close this door. Yeah, this is a nice place to be. I like sitting in this car a lot. I feel like the interior of this car is honestly a perfect blend of sportiness and luxury. You can see our interior is filled with the race text, which is Porsche's Alcantara, essentially, and you've got carbon fiber trim on the doors and certain other parts of the car, the steering wheel right here. But I like that it doesn't compromise in terms of, you know, choosing one or the other, the luxuriousness and the sportiness. You kind of get the best of both worlds, and there's not a whole lot of compromise here. So taking a look around, firstly, these seats, these nice sporty, not really bucket, but kind of like bucket shape front Turbo GT seats. These are really nice seats. Like I said, I did almost 1,000 miles in this car at this point. I did like 700 of the 1,000 miles in just about one day on the first full day of me driving this car. Took it up and down to Carmel from Los Angeles, and it was a super comfortable ride. I had no strain on my back. I didn't feel like I needed to get out and stretch at any point. It's really comfortable. I guess the only downside compared to other high performance EVs is the fact that these seats are not cooled, they're only heated, which, you know, during the summer is kind of a bummer. You wish you could get the cooled seats, but unfortunately not. But if you want to go full rice racer boy with the Turbo GT, and you live in Europe at least, you can get the full carbon bucket seats in this car that are in other cars like, you know, the 911 GT3 and, you know, other high-end two-door Porsches. But overall, this seat is good. I like it. Very comfortable. So your primary point of interaction with the Turbo GT is going to be with this dual screen setup right here, which is quite familiar. There's not that much hardware-wise that separates this from the previous generation Taycan or the other trims of Taycan. It's pretty much one for one exactly the same. So you have your main screen right here, which gives you all of your information. Apple CarPlay, which there is some cool CarPlay related stuff that I want to talk about a little bit later. But other than that, this is kind of the typical Porsche software setup, which for me has been perfectly fine. And then down here, you have your climate control functions right here. So if you hit menu, that allows you to slowly, it's not the fastest software, but it'll get there, but slowly access, you know, your vent control and stuff like that right here, which is all kind of cool, kind of a more archaic version of what Tesla has in their cars. You know, love or hate Teslas, their software is pretty good, and the Taycan honestly doesn't come that close in a lot of ways. But outside of that, with your secondary screen, you can use this as kind of like a mouse pad for the primary screen here. So I can swipe and you can see it's changing what I'm doing on the main screen, which is pretty sick. And then it also has gesture functionality, so I can change my volume. Well, there is no audio stuff playing currently, but I can change my volume with 2 swipes like this, and you can see the screen is responding, trying to change volume, but there's nothing to change volume for. And then if you hit this little 3 hamburger menu right here, that brings down some of your quick functions on the top of the secondary screen. It's a little bit clunky, but yeah. So you see you got your nav, music, phone, vehicle settings, Apple CarPlay, which is nice to have. If you were on the fence of the Taycan because of what you've heard about the first gen software experience, I feel like this kind of fixes whatever I guess was wrong with the first generation Taycan. And it's pretty much exactly the same as what you'd experience in the new Cayenne, the new 911. Presumably when the new 718 replacement comes out, it'll be the same software experience. So I mentioned I'd talk about some CarPlay stuff that's interesting in this car. And yeah, let's get to that. Do you remember when Apple announced like a few years ago at their, I think it was WWDC, this version 2.0 of CarPlay that was essentially going to take over the entire UI of whatever car you're in, to be like Appleified and kind of integrate all of the car's control functions with Apple software and kind of have this perfect harmony of Apple and your car's controls in one software experience, even down to the gauge cluster screen. Well, we still don't quite have that, but they did announce that Porsche and Aston Martin would be the first companies to implement the software. And we don't have the full-blown 2.0 in this car, but we have something of a 1.5, if that makes any sense. So when you connect this car and log in with your My Porsche app, which I highly recommend you do if you have one of these cars, you can essentially access this 1.5 version of CarPlay that doesn't take over the gauge cluster, like I mentioned, but you click that right there, and you kind of have this very seamless blend of car controls and then Apple stuff. I can hit that button to have my AC only coming through the center-facing vents. You can use Siri in the car, another climate control button, and this is like a quick toggle for changing your ambient lighting mode. So you hit that, and it switches between different colors: warm light, lemon green, cold white. And right here, you just have pictures of your Taycan, which, I mean, if you just want to look at the spec you bought, that's cool. And then right here is a button where you can add different photos for, I guess, just if you want to look at a certain photo on your phone. And so right here, I added a picture of this awesome Ford GT90, and then this is the Navara R, which isn't out yet, but will be revealed by the time this video comes out. And I can just toggle between these 2 images that I have here. And yeah, you have lots of different functionality in here. And right here, this is a relax mode that if you had like a version of the Taycan with massaging seats, whoa. I guess that's it. Oh. So I guess it plays this very serene, calming music. And if you had a version of the Taycan that featured massaging seats, you'd be massaged right now while listening to the birds and the serenity. This would be the perfect way to kind of calm down after just doing a record-breaking lap time in your performance EV. Sensational, sensational. But let's turn that off. I'm kind of tired of hearing that. The groundwork is being laid here for a kind of new Apple CarPlay software experience in the car. It's not quite there yet, and so there isn't a lot for me to use with this current iteration of it, but the fact that they're actually working on it and that this is going to kind of become a real thing at some point is, for a lot of people, promising. I know for the Porsche purists, it's like, I just want my analog tachometer and, I hate technology. But for a lot of other Porsche customers, this is like a very ideal thing to have. I guess I also probably shouldn't ignore the fact that, as you can see, we are half full with 120 miles of range. Granted, that is in the highest performance mode, but we throw that into range and we're about 140 miles of range. So essentially, we've got about 280 miles of range in the Taycan Turbo GT. And given its competition, like the Lucid Air Sapphire, the Porsche Model S Plaid, which, the range on that car is, there's a lot of talk about whether it actually has that range in the real world. But 280 below 300 is, for a lot of people, lackluster. And granted, this is only a dual motor car with a lot of power, horsepower, and torque. But yeah, it hasn't been the best experience trying to do long distance road tripping in this car. So on my first full day of driving the car, I drove it to Carmel from Los Angeles. So the destination was about 315 miles away from where I'm staying in LA. And yeah, I had to charge up twice to get there, and then I had to charge up twice to make it back. Thankfully, this does have 350 kilowatt charging capability, and so I went to a lot of stations that happen to have that. Thankfully, I'm in California, which is ideally the best place in America to charge one of these up. And so when I did get to a station after having to wait or find another one that was actually working, the charging was quick. I was usually able to get from 20 to 80% in just barely 20 minutes, which is convenient. And so, yeah, the range is not going to be livable for a lot of people, but a lot of Porsche customers have more than one car and don't need to have their Taycan Turbo GT be their long-distance road tripping car. They're going to have other cars for that. So with that in mind, for a lot of people who are actually going to buy this car, the 280 miles of range isn't going to be a problem. And at least with this car, you're getting an extreme amount of performance. And so, like, the lack of range kind of makes more sense, whereas, like, the Lexus RZ 450e that had pretty much less range than this and like a third of the horsepower. So at least you're getting the performance. Jeez, this thing is quick. A lot of people say that the Taycan drives like an electric 911, and honestly, I wholeheartedly disagree. I just don't think a 5,000-pound electric sedan can replace the feeling of driving a traditional rear-engine sports car. I just don't think that really exists. But I do think it has a lot of things that make it similar to the 911 in terms of the overall driving experience. And one of those is the steering feel. The Taycan almost certainly has the most analog and most satisfying steering feel of any electric car, sedan or not, that I've ever driven, quite honestly. It's just perfectly weighted enough to make you still feel like you're driving something real and not have a completely synthetic experience, but then it's still very confidence inspiring when lugging around this 5,000 plus pound, 1,000 horsepower EV sedan. And I guess I should talk about the performance specs in this car, because I haven't really talked about that at all. So you're looking at 1,092 horsepower, peak power, so you're not getting that all the time, and 914 pound-feet of torque from a dual motor setup and all-wheel drive, obviously. And this thing is just, it's monstrously quick. You just floor it at any speed that you're going, and it just sends you into just a whole other plane of existence. It's absolutely absurd how capable this thing is. And so obviously having a crazy powerful electric sedan in terms of pure power numbers is nothing new in the EV world. And so what makes the Turbo GT stand out from its competition? Well, one of the big factors is the suspension. You firstly got a double wishbone suspension arm setup that makes the turn-in absolutely incredible for a big and heavy car like this. It's just seamless and effortless. You certainly feel the weight, but you don't feel held back or encumbered by it in terms of the mechanical grip. But then there's also Porsche's adaptive air suspension system that has hydraulic actuators on each side of the car that's essentially forcing the chassis down and gluing it to the road when you're taking tight turns and bends and higher speeds. Essentially, body roll is non-existent in this car. You can really try to bring that out of the car, but when you have it in Sport Plus and definitely in attack mode, it's just absolutely planted, which is, really phenomenal when you take into consideration how big and heavy this car is. And for regular street driving, having this really insane and technically advanced suspension setup isn't that big of a deal, but when you're taking this on a track, it makes a world of a difference. And if you're buying the super sporty Taycan Turbo GT version of the Taycan, then presumably you'd want to take it to the track or do like an autocross day at least once, right? And like I mentioned, you really do feel the weight of this car, despite the fact that you're able to handle the weight, and that's even with all the electromechanical assists helping you do what you're able to do in the Turbo GT. And so you really feel that when you take this car into a corner, and then you just feel all the blood rushing around in your head because you're moving around this crazy big and heavy car at insane speeds at ways, I don't think a lot of people's bodies were designed to handle, quite honestly. And so that's where you're reminded that, yeah, this doesn't drive like a 911, because the 911 in its heaviest form weighs like almost 2,000 pounds less than this car, and you're just not going to have that feeling when pushing around a car like that, intensely. But it's still incredibly capable as an electric driver sedan. It's just that it's not a 911 like a lot of people like to say it does drive like one. And so yeah, at the end of the day, just like the Air Sapphire, a lot of this performance stuff is so just absurdly overkill for the street. But I mean, if you have the money to buy this, which is around like 250 grand after options for most people, and want the absolute best track experience for an electric performance sedan, and also want something that's, nice for the street as well, this is probably it. I just wish you could get some better tires on this car, but other than that, this is probably the one. Alrighty. So if you were to ask me what the best overall electric performance sedan is, my answer is still probably the Lucid Air Sapphire, mostly because you don't really have to compromise, generally speaking, in any aspect of owning that car. But if you want to get a little bit more subjective, this is probably my answer. It may not have the range or the interior space or the storage capacity of the Air Sapphire, but you can get this car in crazy colors like this pale blue metallic. You can customize the interior with bespoke trim and stitching options. It's a car you can really make your own. And the Sapphire doesn't really have that. And so this isn't a definitive Air Sapphire killer, but for a lot of people, especially when you factor in the insane track performance, this might be a better choice. And it does a really good job of doing its own thing, which is more of a focus on performance and bespoke styling. But that's pretty much it. That is Taycan Turbo GT. I'm glad I finally had this question answered. And if you guys have any questions about the car, feel free to comment. I'll be hanging out there and checking out what you guys have to say. And yeah, that's about it. Talk to you guys in the next one.